What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Taste Like Music. Jason, Joe, and Crams are here. Side 3 of Sade Week.
Sade. It's pronounced Sade, but it's hardcore British.
Chardonnay.
Chardonnay.
So today we are going to talk about the matchup of the US versus the UK. Which place had better music by decade? So we're going to go through from the 50s through the 2010s and discuss and debate and let you know what our picks are for the better home of pop music in those decades. So here we go. Shall we start with the 50s? Got anything you want to say first?
No, I got nothing.
I'll say one thing. It was a lot easier to choose the winners than I thought.
Really? I think there are
Yes.
some. Okay, well, let's at least try to make it interesting. Yeah.
You guys might have the wrong answer, so I don't know. But for me, there was
That's
only
true.
one decade that was really like, ooh, toss up.
I wonder what decade that is. I think it might be the 80s.
Let's kick it off. Let's 50s. What's your pick for the 50s?
1950s. I think this one is easy. I think there's a general consensus going through like classic rock history where it kind of starts in the mid 60s with the Beatles and on that British people owned it. But I think the 50s, you got to go with the Americans. I think the pop charts are better in America. And Sun Records alone, if you look at the quality and you're making the argument about the Brits owning rock and roll because they appreciated the blues music better, well, I mean, it started with the Americans. I mean, you're talking Elvis, Johnny Cash, Orbison, Jerry Lee Lewis. You got, Benny King and the Drifters. You got all of that like great, sweet 50s pop music coming out. I actually think this one's like a slam dunk for the Americans of the 50s. I don't even think it's close.
Yeah, I agree. I can't even think of a decent UK act in the 50s. He had Elvis, Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Ray Charles, Buddy Holly, Little Richard, Brenda Lee. It's a blowout. There's not even a single UK act that can compete with one of those people, much less.
No.
So yeah, this was the easiest one by far.
And we haven't even mentioned jazz artists yet, like that were killing it in the 50s.
Consensus for all the same reasons you guys just named. 50s belongs to the US. All right, 60s. How we feeling in the 60s? It's a little tighter, maybe.
At first glance, I was thinking, okay, 60s, British Invasion, Beatles, Stones, The Who, Kinks. And then you have a lot of bands that formed in the late 60s for the UK, all the prog bands, all the hard rock bands, but you can't really count them in the 60s because I think the majority of their great work was in the 70s. So when you look at the bands from the US putting out music in the 60s, you had the Beach Boys, Byrds, Hendrix, you had all of Motown, which is significant. Smokey and Marvin and Aretha, and a little guy named Bobby Dylan, who I don't care for, but I hear people go gaga for him. Four Tops, Supremes. I think, the tier 1B and the tier 2 artists in the US just smash whatever was going on in the UK. Cream and Hollies and Zombies and Dusty Springfield and bands like that. Pink Floyd was getting started, but I think the bulk of the great music was coming out in the US, even if you make the argument that in the UK had a little higher peaks with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, which you could make that argument. But I think overall the US takes it in the 60s, which might surprise some people.
That is a shocker to me. Jason, do you agree with Joe?
This one's real close to me because, yeah, at first thought it was like, well, the Beatles. And I mean, you could give it to the UK based on that alone, which I might. You do have the Beach Boys. And then I don't think you even mentioned all like the Phil Spector stuff and the Ronettes and all of that great stuff out of the US. So, yeah, it's pretty tough. But I might be inclined to lean Joe's way because I think, like Joe said, once you get below Beatles and Stones, it falls off a little quickly compared to the US having way more depth, I think, in the 60s, especially through the first half of the 60s. I think there was still that holdover from the 50s where the US was dominating until the Beatles and things started rolling in the UK. So it's close. It's real close, but I might say US on this one too.
I also was like going into the 60s and thinking like this is kind of a slam dunk for the UK, isn't it? I was like, hold on, you got the San Francisco psychedelic sound, you got all this stuff, you got like the early 60 to 65 is dominated by the Americans pretty much with the pop music. But I just don't think you can top Beatles, Stones, Who, Kinks. Like Bob Dylan is the only American artist that really kind of flirts with that to me. Plus like little gems like Nick Drake and all of that. And is he Irish? No, he's Scottish, right?
I don't know. He's from the UK though.
Well, Yeah, I mean, you got Nick Drake in there. It's tough, man. But I think just because, yeah, I think I'm going, and everything that we talked about, like with, the Laurel Canyon, San Francisco sound, Brits were able to infuse that really well. Like British played off American music better than Americans played off British music in the 60s. So I'm actually going the UK in the 60s, but it is damn close. I mean, you also throw in the first couple Zeppelin albums at the late 60s. That helps. Pink Floyd starting up and all that. First Yes album, I believe, in the 60s. It's tight, but that's where I'm going.
I thought
Well,
maybe Hendrix would push it to the US side. Hendrix.
But also that's the
Probably
argument,
going.
is that he was bigger in the UK. Like they were even appreciating our artists
Oh, well,
better
sure,
than we
but
were.
yeah, that's not part of this argument, I don't believe. Come on.
It is for me. So I'm giving it
Plus,
to
I mean,
them.
early 60s, you had still had Ray Charles and all these big US jazz, R&B pop stars. I don't think it's that close, to be honest.
You don't think it's that close? I think it's damn close. Like I think it's like 51-49 for the UK here, and really just because of the Beatles. Like, and that's the big
about
thing, because the Beatles don't exist in the 70s.
no one mentioned Simon and Garfunkel. That's a nice
Yeah, I
little
mean,
bump for the US as well.
it's tough.
US,
And Neil
US is
Young
stacked,
debuted in the
man.
60s.
CCR had a bunch of good albums in the 60s.
No, they didn't. Come on. Let's
Stephen
be real.
Wonder, Marvin Gaye.
Mardi Gras didn't even come out to the 70s.
You ready for the 70s?
70s, yeah.
So I think this one's pretty easily the UK. I don't even know what the argument for the US would be. I mean, you got a handful of bands. Aerosmith. I mean, what US bands are really
You get Springsteen debuting. Dylan's still got great stuff in the 70s. Tom Petty, Talking Heads. But you're right. Like those are, it's an admirable silver medal, but it's not gonna touch T-Rex and Lizzie and Queen and Pink Floyd's best stuff and Zeppelin's best stuff, and
Bowie
even
and
the Who put out Who's Next and Quadrophenia in the 70s.
Elton John and Bowie, and the
Yeah,
list goes on forever. It's
it's
all UK.
Is a
it's and
complete
I'm with you.
massacre.
It's a massacre. I mean, you get the punk movement coming out in the late 70s. It's
Metal, Black Sabbath, I mean,
Prague.
Deep Purple.
Best
The
Prague stuff
Stones
was,
still were going really strong. Queen.
yeah, it's
It's just,
ugly.
I don't even know if the US would beat Canada.
Yeah, they
I
would.
mean, there was like, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, and Rush might be able to put up a pretty good fight against the US.
Yeah, when I think about like even I don't know if other than Springsteen in 75 getting album of the year for me, if I have a non-English, well, no, I have On the Beach for 74 for Neil Young. So two of my 10 winners, I believe, are American, and the others are all from the UK.
I have a fair amount of Americans just because Stevie Wonder won, what, three times, two times in the 70s for me.
Yeah.
Wonder and Springsteen, Marvin Gaye, Steely Dan, Beach Boys are still doing some good stuff, but I mean, it's
In the late 70s, you get the new wave, movement coming in with the Cars and stuff.
I love all the California Laurel Canyon stuff, all those singer-songwriters, but not enough
No.
there's too much going on in the UK.
Joe, have we touched the decade that you said was a nail biter that wasn't obvious yet?
no, we have not.
Are we about to?
So I
Yes, we
thought
are.
I thought long and hard about it with the 80s. Yeah, I thought it would be the 80s, but it's tough because like I love the underground like college rock movement that came out, in the mid to late 80s, REM, Dinosaur Jr., The Replacements. I love all of that stuff, but the 80s are my favorite decade for pop music, and it's mostly because of the British influence. And even like the acts that weren't like the mega like cool like Flock Seagulls and The Cure and all this stuff coming in, like Billy Idol. I friggin' love Billy Idol and like stuff like that. So I'm going there, and you get bands like The Cure, and Bowie still putting out good stuff in the 80s, and Genesis has pretty good pop stuff in the 80s and all that. I gotta go. It's really close for me, but I think I'm going with the UK. And you throw in like Echo and the Bunnymen and stuff, and
Yeah, it's another case for me where the top of the UK takes it, and there's just a really large roster of really strong UK bands. New wave of British heavy metal, Priest and Maiden, Ozzy's still going strong. Then you have people like Elvis Costello and Kate Bush and Peter Gabriel in the art rock scene, Genesis, Police, U2, Talk Talk, the Smiths. The Cure. I mean, it's just so loaded. And I'm not the biggest fan of college rock. I guess if REM is like, the greatest band in your universe, which if you're really into college rock in America, I guess you could make that case. But I mean, Prince and metal, if you like thrash, is really the only case for the US to take the top spot. You have, people like Madonna and Talking Heads, and then you get into stuff like Beastie Boys and a little more of the rap. So if you're into that, I can see the US putting up a fight. But for me, the pop, metal, and art rock and those legacy acts, even Sabbath had some great albums in the 80s for me. Genesis, yes, had some good ones. So I gotta give it to Queen, had some good ones. Bowie still going strong. Squeeze, Phil Collins. It's Depeche Mode. It's pretty much the UK. When you really start thinking about it, I think it's pretty clear.
I don't know. I was just trying to think about who I gave albums of the year to through the 80s. Who was my winner in 86? What came out in 86?
It wasn't so.
No. It was XTC.
XTC, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay.
There
So
you
that
go.
means I gave it to the UK 4 times. I gave it to the US 4 times, and Canada and Australia each have a winner. So, man, it's tight. I feel like the decade starts out leaning UK and kind of closes leaning US.
I also feel that way because you get like into stuff we really like Pixies and Dinosaur Jr. and even Nine Inch Nails, Pretty Hate Machine comes out. And
You also have like Talking Heads and the Cars and stuff in the earlier part of the decade. And this is a nail biter for sure. I think probably again for depth it would go to the UK. I think there's just more below the top tier stuff. I think the top tier stuff is kind of where the US sits, and then below that there's not as much. Yeah, I'll say UK too.
well, that brings us to the 90s, which I think was another tough one because I think it's divided in half, where I lean heavy American for the first 90 to 94, and then I kind of flip on the backside. I'm not saying who I've got for a winner yet, but Joe, what do you think?
This one, the depth of the US, I think takes it because you start to get into rap and you start to get into more of like the underground stuff. And I think the US just kills the UK when it comes to that. Other than Britpop and Radiohead, I couldn't really think of that many Brit bands that I was like really into. And I love the top of the pops, Radiohead, Suede, Blur, Pulp, Ash, Supergrass, Oasis, Cocteau Twins. I mean, the 90s have all of grunge, and you start to get like Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre, and you get stuff like Weezer and the Beastie Boys and Elliott Smith and Rage Against the Machine and Tori Amos and the Black Crowes and Dream Theater and Megadeth. And it's just like an overwhelming, even though maybe the late 90s might lean a little bit to the UK just because of like Radiohead and Supergrass. I think there's just so much more from the US coming out at this point that it's a pretty easy pick for me.
Yeah, this is almost to me like a blowout on the level of the 50s in favor of the US. I think after doing the big Britpop band listographies and not caring for them that much, aside from like Supergrass, this is pretty much like all the grunge and indie and alternative rock from the early 90s being heavily dominated by the US. And then in the later part of the decade with like Fiona Apple and then all the alt country stuff starting up, it's no competition here. It's easily the US.
I am also going with the US. I liked the big Britpop dive we did a lot, like a lot. And like a lot of those grunge acts that I loved in the beginning of the 90s kind of fade away by then. But like Joe said, like you get Secret Weapons in there, like Elliott Smith, and not so secret, but Grace by Jeff Buckley. And I'm kind of thinking like too, if I take OK Computer and the Bends out of it, then I'm not even considering the UK like contending for it. So got to go Americans.
All right. Next one could be a close one, potentially 2000s.
I think this is a blowout for the Americans. It kicks off with like the Brooklyn, kind of artsy scene and all of that. And I don't know if I gave an album of the year winner to a UK artist the entire decade. Oh, other than Radiohead, one with Kid A and Hail to the Thief. That's it. Everything else, I mean, I'm going Ryan Adams, I'm going Animal Collective, I'm going Interpol. Those are like my big three. Flaming Lips, Arcade Fire. None of these are UK bands. Like who are the big UK acts other than Radiohead
Arctic
from the
Monkeys.
2000s? Yeah, no, that's not even
Franz
Not
Ferdinand.
even on my radar. Not even on my radar. None of that.
It's a little closer for me just because plenty of UK bands I like. Doves, Coldplay, Two's Little Renaissance, Radiohead, of course, Ash, Muse had some, a winner for me. Morrissey had some good stuff. Supergrass had some great stuff. Again, like the US is just cranking out so much more. I think they win like 8-2 as far as album of the year winners. Kanye and stuff you guys don't even like that much. Coheed and the kind of new wave of metal with Baroness. You got like pop stuff like Lady Gaga coming out, Killers, AFI, Pearl Jam still going strong, Foo Fighters, Queens of the Stone Age, The Shins, Jay-Z, my favorite probably decade for rap ever. That's all in the US. Yeah, once you really delve in deep, it's a pretty easy win for the US again.
Yeah,
What the hell happened to the UK, man? They just completely lost touch. Late 80s.
I was just playing devil's advocate there a little with Cram and bringing up Arctic Monkeys and Franz Ferdinand, but it's for me easily the U.S. as well. All the Jason Core stuff that's no one else cares about. It's all American. Your Margos, your M Wards, your Bright Eyes, your Modest Mouse, all that stuff.
And for me, it carries over to the next decade. 2010s, I'm going Americans as well, especially with like the female Nashville singer-songwriter kind of movement coming in with those great artists. I'm going Lana Del Rey with a lot of stuff, Father John Misty, all of this sort of stuff. It's all American driven. And it's like this to me is the decade where I really start to like this Americana revival sound. Yeah, I mean, and I still got my favorites from the last decade pumping out some really good stuff like Animal Collective. And yeah, I just feel like who's the UK's big like fall in love with acts like Coldplay makes a lot of ticket sales and they're just terrible. So who is it?
It's another decade where Canada probably beats the UK for me. Always, Wise Blood. I mean, those two alone. I don't even know if I have a single UK act in my top 5 in any of these. Like Adele made one honorable mention. That might be it. Isn't Arcade Fire from Canada too? Like Canada's, I think, pulling ahead of the UK. Partially, I'm gonna count it.
Texas and Canada.
Like UK just, man, shit's weak over there. It's bad.
Yeah, I'm going US again too, obviously. If you look at my nominees for all of those years, I don't know. Has to be heavily US without actually researching that.
No, so I got the US taking the 50s, 90s, aughts and tens. So for me, it's a 4-3 win for the Americans. I mean, I think I still would contend that British music as a collective is better because of the strength of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But I really don't think the UK has come close to competing with American music since the mid 90s. I think that's a problem they need to address,
Yeah, they've been coasting off the 60s, 70s, and 80s for way too long. And really,
Pretty much
Britpop
since
was just like a rehash of like the 60s and 70s. So they haven't come up with anything new in at least 40 years.
ever since they elected Tony Blair, it is pretty much just
So we actually, going by the
coincidence?
2 votes to 1, we only gave it to the UK for 2 decades. It was a 5-2 blowout, 70s and 80s.
And yet the UK still would win like
Yeah.
9-1 if we were just tallying up favorites.
Well,
Just
they
the
got the
top
70s.
30 artists ever.
That's the decade that matters. They got the 70s. So
They have the 70s and they have the best pop music for me in the 80s. So
And the Beatles. And it's tough to beat.
and they have Radiohead for me. Fuck the Beatles. They have Radiohead, the better band.
They have the woman on your shirt and the guys on mine. That's worth something.
Peter Gabriel. They have. I mean, yeah. Funny how that works, but like honestly, why is there such a decrease in the quality of UK music? And I know someone's going to be like, "No, it's out there. You guys just don't know it." It's like, no, it's not out there. Like, I've heard a lot of it. It's not as good. It's just not as good. There's so much very good and above American artists right now. It's crazy.
every UK rock band since the Smiths has some element of the Smiths in their sound. It's like it's just let's keep
Get
doing
over it. Once the Smiths broke up, that's probably
I mean, who other than the 1975, what English act am I just like crazy about? That's like at least under 10 years new. I don't know who it is.
They don't have anybody. And then 1975 is not even that good. So it's like,
Oh, they're
who
good, Joe. Joe.
who am I
They're
supposed
good.
to? I mean, I like them, but they're
Oh,
not.
Joe. Joe, you're kidding yourself. They
Again,
may win the whole 2020s just if they keep pumping it out the way.
none of these bands are even like sniffing my top 250 artists of all time.
Let us know what you think of the US versus UK battle, who you got for each decade. Let us know in the comments. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications. Check all the links in the description, especially Patreon. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.